Namaste and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today. My name is Sanjay Kucheria, and on behalf of the Sanatan Dharm Group, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. Our conversations are an attempt to examine some of the deeper questions shaping Indian society today. Questions of identity, culture, education, leadership, and civilizational continuity. Today's conversation is particularly relevant because we're looking at a question that goes beyond any one political movement or current event. How is the next generation of Indians forming its understanding of India, of its history, and its civilizational inheritance? We will explore this through recent events, but also go much deeper into education, popular culture, social media, family, institutions, and the narratives that shape how young Indians see themselves and their country. Before we begin, a quick note on housekeeping. Session is being recorded. We will have a Q&A segment toward the end of the presentation. Please feel free to post your questions in the question or chat box as the session progresses. We are delighted to have with us Sandeep Balakrishna. Sandeep ji is a writer, historian, and public commentator whose work focuses on Indian history, culture, and civilizational thought. He is the founder and editor of the Dharma Dispatch and author of several books, including Tipu Sultan, The Tyrant of Mysore, and Invaders and Infidels. Through his writing and research, he has explored how historical narratives shape our understanding of India and its civilizational identity. Sandeep ji, thank you for joining us today. It is a pleasure to have you with us. Namaste.
Namaste, Sanjay ji. Thanks so much for inviting me to this session. So yeah, over to you.
Thank you. So let me open this discussion. You, what really sparked this whole reach out to you for me was this essay you wrote that sprung out from the CJP protests. And I don't want us to spend time on the what has transpired on the ground and so on. I'm obviously more interested in going underneath and seeing what is going on there. What it was telling us essentially. So your essay, and it caught my eye, was because you talked about this boatman of Banaras.
Mm.
Your essay doesn't open with the protest, and which is, I love that whole idea of actually opening with this. I've got my own story, which I will share. It opens with this boatman in Banaras whose son had gone back to Delhi for an Andolan, which is a mass agitation or protest movement. The father says one line that I keep returning to, which is that today's children listen only to strangers. Start us there. What did that father understand that his son did?
Okay. Now that you've set the frame, I don't know, right at the place where I began my essay. Uh, Essentially, the underlying meaning is this. It has a very ancient and unbroken cultural and social context. That boatman, he was not alone. I mean, there are thousands of such boatmen in all the sacred Tirtha Kshetras, which is places of pilgrimage in northern India. It could be, say, Kashi, it could be Prayagraj and other places, all sacred Tirtha Kshetras. So that boatman, he was, I think, perhaps the last of a dying race, a dying generation of a society in which a profession or a job was not merely a means of earning a living. In any profession, in every profession, uh, even today, I don't know, I mean, to what extent these things survive, the connection between the job, the means of making money, and the conviction or the shraddha that it is also part of worship, what is loosely known as, or rather what is accurately known as karma yoga. A job until recently was not just a job. It was also a way of discharging your karma. So not just this boatman, but almost every profession since the machines took over, pretty much our whole lives, everything was being done manually, right? If you had to build a bridge, you had to bring in workers. Now the human element is pretty much eliminated in that. You have cranes and things like that. So this man was the perhaps one of the last generations of that tradition. So in his case, because he was, doing his boating across the Ghats, across the sacred Ganga, it was, yes, it was a job, but it was more than a job. It was an expression of his divinity. That I am not plying my boat just on Ganga, just on any other river or water body, but it is the most sacred river from since time immemorial, which is the Ganga. So that is the education he has received. So this notion of separating education from formal and cultural was non-existent. It was a whole. So while boating is a skill and a profession, it was not just merely that. So that is the education he had. So that education came from home. It was inherited, not merely written down in books and taught in the confines of concrete buildings. So he had what is known as well-rounded education. So which also taught him values that when he was a boy, his father, his grandfather, it was all a joint family kind of a setup back then. So he would be exposed to that same thing, that whole inheritance would come naturally to him, organically to him. So you were taught, first of all, that what is loosely known as obeying your parents blindly, unquestioningly. The questions will come later. Right? You first at least plant the seed and give it time to grow. No? It should sprout and then the shoots will come out. You have to give it time. So that is why this unquestioning, treating parents as God comes from Upanishads. Matra Devo Bhava, Pitra Devo Bhava. And then Acharya Devo Bhava. So the order is important. You first regard your mother as your God, and then your father, and then your teacher, and then finally Atithi Devo Bhava, the guest who comes. So this is the cultural milieu he had inherited, which gave him these values, which taught him these things. So by the time that his son's generation came, that there was a splinter in education, to put it very, very mildly. Although he had received this boatman, although he passed on the same education to his child, to his son, the moment the son stepped out of the house, went to school, college, university, wherever, he was out of his cultural depth. Meaning someone else was teaching him things that were radically different, if not opposite, or opposed to what he had learned at home. Which is why he
I
said,
guess, if I may,
which is why he told
yeah,
me that, nowadays people listen to strangers than parents. No stranger, essentially, they're all strangers. Huh? Your schools, your teachers in school, college, and all that. But back then, when our traditional education was still flowing in a continuous way, teachers also regarded their students as their own children. I have had such teachers. I grew up in the 80s,
I
basically.
guess what you're yeah, I guess what you're pointing to perhaps, and this is I'll bring personal observation here. My father grew up in a small town,
Mm,
bordering on a village, basically. Uh, and his only option, if you were to look at it from the perspective of his the profession he would carry on, would be working in his father's shop.
yeah.
I think it was a grain shop of some kind, or something like
Mm,
that. That was it, and he did not. He aspired for something else.
hmm
So now we are talking, early 20th century. We are talking, sorry, mid 20th century. Uh, and he wanted to essentially, to use the terms we use, we wanted to get out and
mm,
go learn something, do something that
mm,
he set his mind on. Not because somebody told him that this is what you should rebel, or you should be rebellious about this, or get away from your parents and so on. But he wanted to uh, go explore. That is the human nature, right? We want to go explore. We want to seek new horizons, build ourselves, grow ourselves. And he did that. And in fact, for him, it was his older brother who
mm,
was the who helped him in that journey to where he left his native place, went to uh,
mm,
Pune, Bombay, and then finally, he made a career and a life in Mumbai now. Um, but I guess with the distinction I would probably draw between him and his experience, and I could probably say even mine as well, from moving from Bombay or Mumbai to Los Angeles,
mm,
is that we kept the cultural
mm,
continuity, maintained the
mm,
cultural continuity. We perhaps did not imbibe, you know,
mm,
um, uh, for the lack of a better term, foreign ideas
mm,
of what our what our the way we viewed our society. That somebody told us this is backward, for example, or this is so and so, and that's what I'm really curious about understanding in this case in your Banaras in
mm,
your boatman of the Banaras situation
mm,
is the son is it seems to me that the son
mm,
essentially from the story
mm,
uh, wanted to participate in what society offered as fruits of the
mm,
labor of previous generations that they had built up to that point,
mm,
becoming an IS officer, so on. At the same time, wanted to also work in bringing the government down, right? With that Andolan, with those protests that he was
mm.
participating in. I'm curious to get your views on that.
No, this happened about
Between my father's, migration from his small native place to Mumbai, and then mine
very.
from Mumbai to LA, and so on.
So that's, I mean, your journey is substantially different from this young man's journey. Uh, what has happened is that that young man had contempt for his profession, his hereditary profession, which his father didn't have. So it is essentially that the environment around him, around this boy, uh, altered his not only altered his worldview, but made him develop contempt for his hereditary profession.
Which,
That is one of the threads in
which
this.
I give it, got it. Which probably is a good segue into my next, area of sort of exploration or question is,
Mm,
you in the article you argued that the education system has functioned as an instrument of what you call child
mm.
abuse for more than half a century.
Yes.
So and I want to make this very concrete for people watching. What
Mm,
is actually being taught? Because
mm,
this really leads to what the discussion we've had so far. What
mm,
is actually being taught? Which texts? What kind of framings do we have? In which institutions? Uh, what are those elements that produce this? So give us some specifics a parent can go and look up tonight.
Okay, so you want a short answer for this or a long answer that
Take,
will
yeah,
take us to history?
go in a direction that makes sense. Yeah.
Oh, sure. So the state, there is a reason I called it child abuse because it has a history which begins roughly with the what is known as the Macaulay's infamous minute. I'm sure you're familiar with that history.
Uh,
Uh,
tell us what it is.
okay, so Thomas Babington Macaulay was a guy of many parts. He was born into British aristocracy, had the classic Western education of that period, the Oxford and Cambridge of that period. So you learn all the classics of the Western canon, classics of ancient Greece and Rome, and then all the way up to the present time. He was molded in that. Plus, he also lived in an era where England was not directly ruling India. The East India Company was ruling India. And Macaulay, when he saw that a handful of Englishmen in a tiny island in Western Europe had subjugated a continent sized country called India and had pretty much become its masters, brought the whole country under their iron grip. So that is when he thought that there is something essentially powerful within us, that this tiny country could do this to such a large nation. And he set about reading, studying all the accounts about India that his predecessor, rather the European colonizers and traders and missionaries, had written about India till then. Based on that, he formed a certain set of opinions about India. And by the way, Macaulay also wrote the first ever biography of Robert Clive. Right? So he came to the conclusion that we are a race of savages, superstitions. We don't know how to live. We don't have culture. We don't have civilization. We don't have education. We don't have manners. We don't have decency. We are semi-barbaric native Hindus with rather crude customs. So since now we have conquered this country, let us civilize the bloody Hindus. These are the words, bloody Indians rather. So one major part, one major program of civilizing the natives was to introduce the English system of education in India. So you thereby you produce entire generations of Indians who will grow up in that educational mold and then become nothing higher than clerks serving the British East India Company. So this is the mindset that produced the English education system specifically for India. So he put down his thoughts, a policy document, which later became known as the Macaulay Minute. So what it did essentially was to cut off Hindus from their roots. So that was an unprecedented, what you call, the beginning of an unprecedented change for the worse. In the overall reckoning, it was a change for the worse, although it had its good points. But when you measure it in terms of long-term outcome, it has been nothing but a unmitigated disaster. And it began to produce the first generation roughly in the second half of the 19th century. And that generation grew up, was concentrated pretty much in Bengal. Why Bengal? Because that was where the British won the decisive battle of Palashi. The word Plassey is actually Palashi. Palashi means Palashi Vriksha. It is a name of a tree. which is a favorite of Bhagavan Shiva. So when instead of using Palashi, if I use Plassey, look what all you have lost. You only call it a city, but its whole cultural and devotional heritage is lost forever. Right. So that is when the larger Bengali society saw this new generation educated in the British fashion, it was alarmed. That is when the first era of Indian Renaissance began. It began in Bengal. That is when that was a period which produced people like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar, then Swami Vivekananda, that whole batch, Ashutosh Mukherjee, Rabindranath Tagore, all those people had a universal term of contempt for the British education system. The first ever university in India was set up, not coincidentally, in Calcutta and in the year 1857. Exactly the year of the First War of Indian Independence. These things are not coincidental. That's why we must not study these things in isolation. But anyway, I'm digressing. So these stalwarts of Indian Renaissance, they universally condemned Indian British system of English education, and what they said and wrote in public platforms was they had a name for these English schools and colleges. They called it Golam Khanas, meaning factories producing slaves for the British Empire. So from then, because the British had imperial power, there was not much that Indians could do on their own. Whatever they did with their limited means at their disposal, they did. They gave a huge kind of a setback against English education. But then people have to make a living. And if the only way to get a job is to undergo education in this education English system, so be it. So you essentially had no choice. If you look at the history of all great institutions, educational institutions that were begun at that time and that which still continue, most of them were started as resistance and parallel systems against the mainstream English education. Most of them. That's a history that needs to be written. And in my estimate, if somebody investigates the history of those institutions in a holistic way, it will produce not less than 4,000 pages of scholarly work. That is a material that exists. So from then, I'll come back. I'll come to that. Okay. I told you I'm going to give you a long answer. So you have to endure the suffering.
Of course.
All right. So from then on, with the dominance of the English education, you had a new elite, Indian elite, which was carved out from the same society, but which looked down upon their own society, just as their British masters looked down upon bloody Indians. This elite did not exist before that, before English education. So it is to this elite class that people like Jawaharlal Nehru and others belong. So they had utter contempt for our culture, basically cut them off. And in Ananda Kumaraswamy's memorable quote, and everybody should memorize this, he basically says that a single generation of English education suffices to produce a superficial and undefined being. I'm paraphrasing it, a superficial and undefined creature that has no past and no future, and which belongs neither to the east nor to the west.
Pretty powerful.
So he wrote this in 1925 or 1928, Ananda Kumaraswamy. But then, yeah, whatever happened. And one of the big mantras of Indian freedom struggle apart from the political phase, was decolonization. And post 1947, now I'll come to a point. Post 1947, instead of getting decolonized, we colonize ourselves even much on a bigger scale, to a deeper extent than the British had ever managed to do. So for every Indian problem, Nehru and his friends and his buddies, his close circle, they looked for solutions not only to the West, but they looked for solutions to Russia, which was a communist country. So you're colonized, you
The Soviet
already,
Union.
yeah, Soviet Union. So you basically, I don't know how to put it, clearly, but you willingly colonized yourself in a double manner. First, you have, instead of unburdening yourself, the colonization always occurs at the psychological level. So that poses the biggest problem. So instead of shaking off these colonized psyches, you not only perpetuated it, but you looked at a wholly alien ideology called communism and began to take inspiration from Soviet Russia. So another foreign ideology. For Indian problems, you can't have Western solutions. Whatever worked for the West, for Europe, for US, whatever problems they had, they evolved solutions based on their own thinking and analysis of their situation, their problems, whatever, their issues, whatever. But I think India is perhaps the only country in the world which, after getting political independence, colonized itself deeper, kept looking at help solutions from abroad. And by the time of independence, one new element had already been introduced and was growing steadily powerful. That was the communists, who had already formed a political party, the original Communist Party of India, CPI. They slowly began to infiltrate institutions, mainly public institutions, the bureaucracy, but mainly education. And Nehru began to give patronage to these people. And his daughter took it to a different level. She had no cultural affinity to anything Indian. She had no affinity to anything or anybody except power. That story is well known. Otherwise, sir, from 1947 to 1975. So how long is it? In about 20 plus years, you had a quasi dictatorship. These things are connected. You had a quasi dictatorship which evokes the question of the real meaning of freedom. Your own people can oppress you much better than a foreigner because they've grown amongst you. So once the communists took over, which was the takeover was directly facilitated by Indira Gandhi. That is when they began to rig the syllabus because they had institutional control. And every lesson, syllabus mainly in languages and history, what is loosely known as humanities. So they began to rig and manipulate the actual syllabus and the textbooks and the contents. Just to sum up, give a summary of how they rigged it in the initial stage. So this rigging of the education system done by communists occurred in roughly about 4 stages. First was the institutional capture, then the framing of the syllabus, and then the rewriting of textbooks. And then by then you already had one generation of students who read only those textbooks because there were no alternative textbooks prescribed or could be prescribed. because education is a state subject, meaning it is controlled by government. So to give a broad uh, points about the kind of lessons, and this is most pronounced in history, to accept the Aryan invasion theory as true. So what happens if the Aryan invasion theory, which is fake by the way, spurious, has no basis, has no logic, cannot be verified, no evidence. If you accept it, what it basically means is that India was never an united and independent country. It had no culture, it had no civilization. Everything that is good about India or was good about India, everything that Indians could take pride in is not native. It was all brought by foreign invaders, not just foreigners, foreign invaders. So this is a long-term calculated damage by done by propagating Aryan invasion theory. So once you have established that you were always a land of invaders, then it becomes easy to justify everything, all invaders. So medieval Muslim invaders were actually heroes, and those who resisted them were rebels. Medieval Islamic rule, alleged Islamic rule, was a period of where real culture, art, music, dance, sculpture, painting, architecture, sculpture flowered. It was an era of peace and plenty, and India was overflowing with wealth, and it was a land of milk and honey. So this, and you break up this vast subject into tiny little chapters and feed it from a very young age to children. There is nothing in which in these textbooks there are no lessons prescribed that will make a good patriotic and nation loving citizen. You're taught to hate your own country and culture from a very young age. And so what is the first thing you do when you grow up and graduate? You will look for a US visa.
Which probably is a good, again, a good
I hope I've
segue to my
answered it.
next.
No, I hope
Yes,
I've
you
answered
did.
your question,
You
although
did.
it was.
Yes, you did. And it
And
actually
now,
brings us to a point where
no, no,
we,
sorry, I
yeah,
forgot to add to this.
yeah,
Now things have reached
please.
to such a stage where all our epics, Ramayana, sacred literature, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puranas, all are stories that we revere, we worship. We don't just read them. For the longest time, no Hindu child actually read Ramayana and Mahabharata. They learnt it on the laps of their grandmothers or mothers. It was a living tradition, it still is. But the same Ramayana and Mahabharata, when they are introduced in textbooks, how are they presented? They are presented as as backward texts, as books that teach oppression. The Bhagavad Gita is a book of war. It is a user manual of war. That's what Wendy Doniger writes. So this is taught to children.
I guess.
Now you have come to a stage where you're taught to rebel against your parents. So you see the evolution, sir.
Yes, absolutely.
First, you don't.
So it's
First,
a rebellion for rebellion's sake, though.
yeah, for its own sake. So first, you are taught
Yeah.
to take no pride in your own culture and literature and heritage. Then you obviously move in. What is the next stage? Your parents and everybody who teaches you that our culture is to be respected and venerated. So anybody who teaches these things are people whom you should rebel against, even if they are your own family members, even if they're your own parents. This is being taught.
Now, there has been, and I think it brings me to this area of exploration, I should say, that I'm I'm interested in getting into next, which is, you talk about children being taught to be derisive about uh, their culture,
European.
their background, etc. Their own, well, I mean, yeah, it starts there and then extends into culture and society and so on.
Mm,
Um, how does and we saw this one clip where I think some people were mocking Prime Minister Modi's
mm. Mother.
pronunciation of the word friends.
Mm, yeah.
Well, no, 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 we are not even talking about that. I'm not even going
Oh,
there right now.
okay. Okay.
I'm just talking about mocking him uh, for the way he pronounced friends. I mean,
Mm.
obviously, he was not brought up in a what we call a convent education
Convent
to
education.
know what is
Yes.
the right pronunciation of
Yes.
for exactly that's the term for because I was used also in marriage ads by the if you
Mm.
remember.
Yes.
Um, yeah, but this is something I find perhaps hard to explain. Maybe I do. Maybe I have an explanation for it, but maybe you can elaborate this for us. A young Indian who mocks his own tradition, his elders, his historical figures as well. You
Mm.
touched upon a lot of that. He feels intelligent doing it. If
Mm.
he feels that this is sophistication rather
Mm.
than loss. In
Yes.
fact, I would say the abuses that you
Mm.
briefly referred to
Mm.
fairly, I would say, personally for me, I found it very vile, very disgusting uh, and very personal. One is to say I abuse the system, another to say I abuse an individual, a person at an individual level, and you use almost the vilest of things, the vilest of language that you can use. Where does this reflex come from? This reflex of looking at everything that individual's uh, uh, being is
Mm.
their traditions, cultures, their traditions, their culture, the language, even their historical figures. The contempt. Where does that come from? Where does that reflex come from? Feeling that contempt and actually thinking that this makes them sophisticated. Because when you watch the videos, it seems almost like to me it felt like uh, somebody crying out to say, "Hey, look at me! Look at how sophisticated I am! Look at how evolved I am! Look at how forward-thinking I am!" That was sort of the underlying thing that was coming at me when I was watching these videos and this the some of the protests that were going on. Help me understand this. Help us unpack this. Uh,
Yeah.
this
It,
is
go, it goes back again to the same colonial education, the colonized psyche. So what English education did, like I said, was it created a brand new elite from by breaking the same society. And this elite blindly swallowed the contempt that British had for Hindu culture and civilization and their heritage. So this deeply colonized Hindu psyche was also a reflection of their inferiority complex. It goes down to that level. You feel inferior because you have internalized their contempt for them, for the British, for Europeans. India was an alien culture, which they didn't bother to understand in its depth, in its profundity, in its sheer longevity. We are the most ancient civilization even today in the world. None of the ancient civilizations has survived. We are the last men standing. You look at the map of the world, you have
yeah.
52 pure Islamic countries, and Christianity is present in every single continent on this earth. Both of them are Abrahamisms, or some people call them Semitic religions. We are not. This is the only Hindu country in the world which has outlasted both these, which is older
Well,
than both these faiths. and has outlasted all their combined atrocities put together. So one
Well,
section,
where would you slot
hmm,
where would you slot, just to add here, where would you slot a country like China? That's a
China
question one
has
of
erased,
our
no, China
guests
has
is asking.
erased, no, China has erased its pre-communist past completely. All they now have is some semblance of Confucius studies and the rest of it. But the pristine Buddhist tradition that China took from India, that is obliterated. Buddha survives, the Buddhist tradition survives throughout Southeast Asia except in China. It survives even in Korea and Japan, not in China, which is the largest country in Asia in
So
landmass.
if I may, so if I may, Sandeep ji, in that, you mentioned, you've talked about the the Macaulay's project.
Hmm.
I'm using that term
Yeah, it is a project.
to mentally subjugate. It's a
Yes,
project. It's a mentally subjugate
it's a project.
Indians
Yeah.
to get them to
Hmm.
essentially become
No, they were meant to,
second-class citizens, if you will.
yeah, they were meant to be clerks.
Yes, essentially
They were
become.
not, they were not meant to think on their own.
Yeah, they were meant to do
That
work. They were meant to
that
be produce
mindset,
workers, essentially. That's
Sanjay ji, that mindset is best reflected today in two areas of Indian life: the bureaucracy and the judiciary. An average judge has Oscar Wilde at his fingertips, but hasn't even heard of monumental volumes of the history of Dharmashastras, which will be more useful to him, to the judge, him or her, than quoting
Hmm,
Oscar Wilde and whoever it is, Perry Mason or whatever.
right. But I
So,
guess, in
so
that evolution, sorry,
this inferior
sorry,
what inferiority complex did to this class of Indians is that it
mhm.
automatically regarded the white race or the European race as superior, not merely superior, but inherently superior. And that the whole purpose of their life and to bring up their children in that mold. And how do you do that?
So
So they wanted to become Englishmen. Basically, the highest aspirant of this new Babu Brown Sepoy or whatever you want to use of this new Indian elite class was basically to imitate the British in dress, in culture, in behavior, in the way you pronounce certain words, right? In your food habits, everything. You disown everything that was yours. So that is
Sandeep ji,
why the more you
Sandeep ji,
deride.
if I may interject here, if I may interject here, so that aspect is very, very clear, I think, these days to people, right? This whole
No,
uh,
I was,
colonization of the Indian mind.
no, I was
Yeah,
addressing
but
your point
the other
about,
point you
so my point was to address
right,
your earlier question about how these people took pride that it was some kind of a expression of sophistication comes from here.
correct. But then you also
So
made some other point as well, which is the
these are the
leftist.
roots. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And then
These
the
are
other
the
point you
roots.
made, which I wanted to, yeah,
Good, good. Huh.
yeah.
Please go.
So you made this other point
Hmm.
of how post-independence,
Hmm.
the left, if you will, communists, etc., the left essentially took over in a way, or influenced deeply in a way, the education system that ended up then producing the next generation of
Hmm.
Indians who
Hmm.
became further alienated from their
Yes, yes.
civilization, from their culture, from their,
Hmm.
even being mocking towards their own language or the way somebody spoke certain words.
Hmm.
Uh, I so where the Macaulay project produced a certain had a set of Indians with a certain set of attributes. Uh, this set of Indians, which really, or this generation of Indians that we've gone through the last two, three generations, that has gone through this system of education that we've all gone through, you and I both as well. We have seen that influence certainly, but what does that portend
Mm.
for India? I mean, I'm really now trying to get to where does this all go from here?
Mm.
Where you have a significant leftist view, worldview, which cuts across borders, by the way. So
It does.
it's something that also
It's
it
global.
it also runs deep in it's global. It runs in the US as well, on US campuses and in US life generally. We see that influence, fairly heavy influence, where the first project for any leftist is to make sure that you forget your past, and that you become part of this big blob, essentially, in the way you think, in the way you act, in the way in the way you behave, etc. And in the way you look at power, that it is something to be upset, it's something to, it's something to take down, to topple governments. That is really that's really the way they conduct themselves. Uh, how do you see that in the Indian context, where you've mentioned, and I had the similar point, that we are the only living civilization uh, today, ancient
Yes.
civilization that lives on today, and that has managed, in spite of invasions and so on, to not just survive but to thrive as well. Now, I can say.
Mm.
But where does this take us next? Where does this go next with this generation that has been fed on these ideas and that finds great appeal in them?
Mm.
Where do you go from here? And what is it that society at large can do, governments, but also the people in society, general public, I can say, what can they do to shift that trajectory, particularly for this next generation, the Gen Z, if you will, and the ones that will follow them as well.
So that's a lot of things that you've packed.
So I was trying to tie all these different threads you have. Yeah, I was trying to tie all these different threads you have put out there so far. I want to see, okay, where does this go from here? With all these different
Okay, so this,
influences, this way of, yeah,
so what you're now seeing
please.
everywhere throughout the world, since you brought up left, it is nothing new. It is a very, very old project which dates back to Karl Marx. And in theory, it dates back to Karl Marx. What you are now witnessing is its third incarnation or second incarnation, broadly speaking. The communists have always, Karl Marx recommends a violent overthrow of existing order. Right? In his world, in his demented, he was a lunatic basically, not a normal human being. In his world, his so-called analysis of human history basically says that this whole past capitalist versus the working class versus the producing class, the capitalist class, which has to be overthrown. The bourgeois class is to be overthrown for a new communist paradise of a land overflowing with milk and honey, where everybody are comrades and all are treated equally. Russian Revolution happened. How did it happen? It didn't happen through elections. It happened through a violent coup, mindless violent coup. Sir, here is the thing, sir. The communist ideology is global. Karl Marx had an answer, a lasting, a timeless, and fail-proof solution for all of mankind, for all of eternity. So it is from in theory and practice, it was always global. And when communism succeeded, the ideology succeeded in Russia and translated into political power, what did it do? It created a dictatorship, perhaps the most brutal dictatorship the world has ever seen. Communism is responsible for the maximum number of genocides in less than a century. in less than a century. So then what happened? Because it is global in nature, it fomented USSR was the Communist Party of USSR had several sister organizations throughout the world, and one central organization known as Comintern, meaning Communist International. That's the short form of it. Its only job was to spread communist propaganda, topple governments throughout the world. Hungary became communist. The whole so-called Cold War, the so-called Eastern Bloc, the communist bloc, how were they created? Through violent coups. And by the way, now that we are mentioning this Gen Z and all that, there was a version of Gen Z back then in Austria or Hungary around the 1930, 31 or 32. The existing government was overthrown by the communists, and one of the revolutionaries became the education minister. Guess what he did as his first policy decision? He introduced sex education in kindergarten. So what you're seeing now on US campuses in schools, where kids are being taught the joys of masturbation. I'm sorry for but that's true. You had protests there. You should know better than me. So this is not new. I'll come to your point. And then when the USSR fell, USSR was the country which was given to communists, an ideology which had its own country. When that fell, funding fell, communists in other dependent and satellite states, Berlin Wall didn't fall by accident. So these are all linked. And then the communists had a lull because it had no Russia, no Comintern. And China, after the 70s, China didn't really kind of become a pakka communist country in the sense that the USSR was. Actively spreading communist propaganda. It spread Chinese propaganda. More of Chinese propaganda, but to a lesser extent, communist propaganda. I'm generalizing it, but yeah. So you had a lull of 2 decades. And if the communists are good at one thing, they are good at recouing, they're good at reinventing themselves. The USA had won the political war by bloodlessly toppling the Soviet Russia. But around the same time, its own campuses had been infiltrated by a new gang of academics who called themselves cultural Marxists. So this is a whole ecosystem which calls itself by different names like cultural Marxists, critical race theory, this sort of thing. So it is what they were doing is essentially social engineering or social re-engineering. All your Max Horkheimer, the Frankfurt School, infamous Frankfurt School. Frankfurt School began a century back, 1930s May, late 1920s May it started. So they take their time, systematically they spread their tentacles. Their first tactic is always institutional capture. So by the time the USSR
If I
fell,
may,
no, I'll finish.
yeah,
So
yeah.
by then, the US campuses had been infiltrated with these cultural Marxists. And by the turn of the millennium, they had pretty much captured the minds of the leaders and members of the Democratic Party in the US. Your previous president, Obama, he is one of the finest product of cultural Marxism. His parents were avowed communists of the old style. So that is how they change their tactics. As simple as that. It is always a global project. Back then, it had political power, so it was in your face that, okay, this is the enemy we have to fight for. US had that target. USSR is our sworn enemy because he's visible. The academics were not visible, no, in their backyard.
So if I may then, I know we're getting close
So
to our hour here.
the same
Yeah.
disease that you see in US campuses, pretty much like I've written in my article, it is
Hmm.
seen on Indian campuses as well, but not to the extent that cancer is not spread out here to the extent that it is visible out there. But all these
So
Gen
in
Z
that,
CJP type of people, they
right.
are they are a uniform body. It is a monoculture in one sense. So their skin color is different, but their attitudes, their slogans, their body piercing, and all the I don't know what they do to their bodies. Really, it's very worrying. So the language and the behavior, the attitudes, it's the same thing, cut from the same
So
cloth.
we are getting close to, so Sandeep ji, we are about 3 minutes from our
Okay.
end of our session. I want to just close with one question, and if you'll have 2 minutes maybe to answer
Yeah.
this.
Okay.
And this is something I want to also bring in an audience question with something I was going to ask. We with all these issues and all these problems you've talked about,
Hmm.
particularly with academia and the way it has
Hmm.
fashioned minds
Hmm.
over the last couple of generations.
Hmm.
What are the state and non-state paths to
Hmm.
to to correct this? I guess there was NEP was probably one such attempt, but what does a government like BJP do in this instance? What do we as individuals, as parents,
Hmm.
uh, uh, i- perhaps private institutions of some kind, what
Hmm.
can we do to make corrections in the
Hmm.
trajectory
Hmm.
of where this and the next generation are going?
Not just the
And you have two
BJP.
minutes.
Yeah, 2 minutes difficult, but I can't write short pieces. It's always long contemplative pieces. That's
Of
how I
course, of
that's how
course.
I approach it. So uh, you have to kind of suffer my words if they spill beyond 2 minutes. So yeah,
No
uh,
worries. Well,
throughout the world, like I said, now it boils down to institutional capture mostly across the world, barring countries like China, Japan, and handful of countries like that. The leftist capture has been thorough. So now the pool of culturally rooted people in the academia. I don't know the situation in the US, but out here, the pool of culturally rooted faculty in the academia is very, very, very less. So if I have to quantify in terms of ratio, uh, culturally rooted Hindu professors and faculty are outnumbered by a ratio of 1 is to 23, if not more. So while the NEP was a policy in a good direction, the whole ecosystem is infested with these people. You change the syllabus, you change. This is essentially generational work, and there is no talent at the ministry level to even understand the extent of damage. The last chance that we had for course correction was during Atal Bihari Vajpayee's time. And Murli Manohar Joshi is still the best education minister India ever had. So that we missed the bus there. So anyway, it's all downhill now. So looking for solid solutions from government is difficult, although not for the lack of intent, but for the lack of even understanding the extent of the rot. If you have to stem this tide at this point, and if a government level solution is to be given, you have to fire every single left leaning ideologue or academicians across disciplines. Short of that, there is no solution. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not exaggerating. These fellows who protested the so-called Gen Z, the cockroach thing, they were creations, proud creation of teachers. So you see how this leads back to my story in Kashi, that what to do, children of today listen to strangers. Strangers have no
But there's
filial
that.
interest. Yeah. And in this case, these
Yeah. So I
strangers are
guess.
evil people. So yeah, that
So I
so
guess.
the parallel solution done by initiatives run by private individuals will help. And there's on this subject in various seminars that I've spoken, I always say this one slogan like a mantra: don't send your children to mainstream schools. At some or the other point, if they're not balanced enough, at some or the other point, they will be taught to become revolutionaries, and at some point, they will shoot you down if they perceive you as the enemy of the revolution. So please don't send your children to mainstream schools. And for God's sake, examine the contents of the syllabus. But like I said, I mean, that's just stretching it too far. The simple solution is get your children off these mainstream schools. And when, because education is now a business, unlike a sacred calling in the past, when it hits the bottom line of the schools, they will fall in line. So until such
And
time,
Sandeep
point
ji,
private tutors
yeah,
for hardcore subjects like science and chemistry and mathematics and technical subjects. Rest of the cultural education, you get it done at home. If you are too busy to teach cultural education to your children, approach the nearest purohita of your nearest temple and make
thank
sure
you, Sandeep
you
ji. I know.
teach cultural education by celebrating festivals, cooking food, eating together, cooking especially sweets during festivals. So this is generational work, and I will stop here. I can go on.
It is certainly, I think, an hour is not enough for the topic that we touched on today. But I do thank you for a very insightful discussion
Thank you.
on something that I think we could probably go on for multiple sessions.
Yes.
I mean, just the last few comments you made could be a session on its own.
Mm.
But today's conversation reminds us that a civilization remains alive when each generation understands its inheritance, engages with it critically, and finds the confidence to carry it forward. And might I also add, own their inheritance with pride and thoughtfulness. After all, and I made this point earlier in our call as well, that our Bharatiya civilization is the only one among all ancient civilizations that continues to live through a billion people practicing it daily. So thank you once again for sharing your time and perspectives with us.
My pleasure, my honor, sir.
Our
Thank
next
you.
Dharma Live session.
Mm.
Thank you so much. Our next Dharma Live session will be held on 27th August when Swami Sarveshananda ji will speak on leveling up consciousness, the seven stages of inner mastery. So we will go from the outside to the inside. The session will explore the profound questions and practical insights from the Yoga Vasishta and their relevance to our lives today. And in my view,
Yoga
Yoga
Vas-
Vasishta is one of the
Yoga
most
Vasishtha is one of
profound
the most
texts.
elaborate treatises, and not exactly meant for the layperson, but it's an extremely profound text. And one of the
Well, that's why we
most
have Swami
elaborate.
Sarveshanand.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, that's why we are Swami Sarveshananji help, distill it down to a few things that we can use and adopt and adapt, or adopt, I should say, in our lives. So we look forward to having you joining us. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. A recording to this link will be available within 48 hours. Namaste.
Namaste.